Welcome back to another live broadcast for the Star Wars Unlimited Judge program. As always, I'm your host, Jonah, and today we're going to be talking about investigations. How is everyone doing today? How are folks feeling? I just got back from lovely Las Vegas, where it was really warm, and now I'm in lovely Massachusetts, where it is also really warm. I think it was close to over 100 Fahrenheit, so close to 40 Celsius in Vegas, and same temperature here. Thankfully, in a basement currently, with some boxes that are starting to teeter just a little bit because uh, they've lost structural integrity due to the humidity, which is real comfortable. Good trip. Yeah, it was a good trip. I had a lot of fun with that. But let's dive into today's topic. We're going to be talking about investigations. We're going to be talking broadly in two categories for investigations. We're going to be talking about objective investigations and subjective investigations. Objective investigations include game state investigations, pretty much any sort of handling a call, lowercase investigation, just determining reality, figuring out what is happening in a game, figuring out the facts of a situation. And then subjective investigations are what most people think of when you say, I did an investigation. Most people are thinking of cheating investigations, trying to determine a player's intent. Those are a different creature. However, you can't be good at a subjective investigation, in my opinion, unless you're good at objective investigations. If you're not able to be confident in what happened with facts, when you're working off of intent, you're just going to be throwing darts at a dartboard. For a lot of people think that investigations are probably one of their weakest qualities as a judge. So many experienced judges are like, yeah, investigations just can't do them. And we'll talk about why that is. I also am on a bit of a clock. As you may have seen, we're packing up, we're moving, which means that we're going to actually have some folks come by touring the place and doing a walk through the house, and I'm not going to have random strangers broadcast to the internet. ST77M says, do you know what time the meetup will be in Vegas? I don't have the exact time. That's still something that I'm coordinating with ACES. The plan is it will occur after the judge training. So early evening is the current plan. I'm also working with FFG. We had some emails back and forth over the last week walking down where exactly in the venue we'll be. We're going to be in the Venetian. We're going to be in one of the rooms, not the main hall. And roughly an hour at some point after the training for staff occurs. I don't have harder details than that. I'm waiting to get some of that more information just so I can be like, here's all the information at once, rather than be like, it's going to be at a time. It's going to be at a place. It's going to be like, I want to have it all complete rather than dribbling it to you. But we're going to dive into investigations. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in chat. I'm going to keep an eye on the clock, so I'm done in an hour. We're going to pretend that that's plausible. Alrighty. So, an investigation is anytime you want to get information from a player, which means pretty much anytime you interact with players. I mean, the vast majority of my calls have at least the one question of, what can I do for you? In that case, I'm investigating what I can do for the player. Wolfstrider562 says the Taco Bell down the street. Got it. No, not the Taco Bell down the street. There's actually a great taco place or burrito place that I went to Sunday. I don't know what time it is anymore. Sunday. That's close to Mandalay Bay. It's a little bit further away from the Venetian, but very, very good, very large burritos. Anyways, tangents today. There's a lot of focus on cheating investigations. They're the high profile ones. There's the ones that are exciting to talk about. But there are far, far more calls where you need to figure out what happened in the game than if you need to figure out whether or not a player cheated. Going through the steps of clear communication, understanding what players are saying, understanding what players are meaning. If a player asks you a weird question, like, hey, can I play a Vanquish even though my opponent doesn't have any units? Figuring out what they actually want to ask is an investigation. There is a chance that they just want to know, can I vanquish my own thing even if my opponent doesn't have any units? They might also be trying to figure out, can I play Vanquish and pick no units even though I have units? And figuring out how to get that information without giving outside assistance is an investigation. You need to figure out what they're doing. It is a skill that you can develop. We're going to look at a variety of specific subcategories of objective investigations. I do want to get to the point where I have some footage of these where I lay out an actual board state with actual cards and then say, hey, how many cards should this player have in their hand right now? Figure it out, you do the math. And then provide just information about the game. And you can look at what's in play, figure out what the possible answers are, what questions you would need to ask. However, my cards are not currently accessible, and I want to take the time to do it right, and so that'll likely come at the tail end of the L2 lessons. Here we have the theoretical, and we'll give you a little bit more practical experience later on. But let's talk about finding evidence. So, with these objective calls, you're determining what has mechanically happened in the game. This is past events, things that has happened, things that both players should be aware of. You have a lot of tools at your disposal, and we're going to walk through them as soon as I handle this tangent in the chat. Mightstone12420 says, can level 3 and above exams be essay form? They're not going to be purely essay, because a lot of information like rules knowledge is still relatively straightforward. Do you know this or do you not? And there are costs to having non-multiple choice exams, having written portions. A multiple choice exam, you hit submit, it gets graded automatically and you get it back. And then if you pass, you get your certification. Right now, if you take the exam and pass the exam, you will know within seconds, maybe a whole minute if your internet is slow, what your result was. You can look at your exam, get feedback immediately, and you get your certification immediately. If it is Jonah has to grade every exam, let's say I'm traveling for an event, it's a 4-day event, so I leave on Wednesday. That's the day that you take the exam. I'm not able to sit down to read your answers until I get back. I get back on Monday. I'm sick. I'm not able to work until Wednesday. You get a whole week delay. Even if we expand, that's gonna be difficult. Furthermore, it dives into subjectivity and developing a rubric that is for fair grading, and so people can get consistent results and can understand what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong, takes a lot more effort than creating a relatively straightforward multiple choice exam. With regards to volunteering, we're not taking volunteers. We're a for-profit company. If somebody's doing work for us, we're paying them. And some of this evaluation is coming from my decade of experience judging. I do want to have some amount of open response questions, but those are going to be relatively few, only a couple on the L3 exam. McFerguson says, squishy policy questions are tough to write good multiple choice exam questions for. Absolutely. I am hoping that it's probably not going to happen in time for the level 2 exam, but shortly thereafter, the updates to policy will make it so that the policy answers are a little bit more concrete. Right now, some of the fixes are the judge fixes it as they best see fit, as opposed to, in these scenarios, do this. In these scenarios, do this. In these scenarios, do this. The more specific policy gets, which it will be eventually, the easier it is to write, one, educate, and two, write exam questions for. Mad Dog Max says, I was noticing a bunch of conventions are mostly voluntary, mostly perk rewards. That's how some people do things. But again, we believe both ethically and morally and legally, if somebody's doing work for us, we should pay them. We do have a couple of folks who are doing contract work for us. We're hoping to expand soon. I have write job descriptions on my to-do list. But yeah, we're not going to take on volunteers. Anyways, let's talk about the tools you have for... DFN Ray says, I was hoping to get my endorsement from my local shop, but they lost their login info for the next page. I was hoping to get one from helping out in Minneapolis. Have them shoot me an email, and I can help them with account recovery. Just jonah@cascadegames.com, and we can take care of things there. Or questions@cascadegames.com, and we'll be able to sort it out from there. But, right. Objective facts, how to get information. So, you have the cards in play, the cards that you can see. You can see the distribution of damage. You can see tokens and counters on cards in play. You can see cards in discard. You can see the number of resources a player has, whether they're exhausted or ready. The number of cards players have in their hand or deck. Sometimes you'll have a player's notes. They'll have written down what was in their opponent's hand previously. Or they've been tracking base damage totals as an auxiliary set of tracking, which helps you reconstruct the game in several ways. You also have the memory of both players and spectators. And after you separate players, you can talk to them about their strategy and intent. While this doesn't necessarily give you facts about the game, it can help jog their memory and help them reconstruct the game state. Furthermore, once you've separated players, you're able to look at cards in hand and cards and resources to help establish what has come before. So, let's start with a common piece of information you need to find. What part of the deck is random? When we're shuffling cards back into a deck because they were accessed at an incorrect time, whether it's a card manipulation error or something else has us shuffling a card into a deck as part of a fix, we want to preserve the random portion of the deck and the known portion of the deck. For example, if a player uses Inferno 4, R2-D2, U-Wing Reinforcement, Darth Vader, a card that lets them see cards at the top and then put some number onto the bottom, it's important to preserve those cards on the bottom. Both because sometimes those cards are good and sometimes those cards are bad, and we want to keep those cards where they belong. An example of this is if you play U-Wing or Vader and you see a powerful event that you would like to have, unfortunately that's going on the bottom, no choice of keeping it on top. And that player's game decision of play Vader at this point in time meant that that card went on the bottom and that card should remain on the bottom, or in that bottom section. And so we don't want to shuffle that back in. Similarly, if it was a bad card and the player intentionally put it on the bottom with, say, Inferno 4 or R2, and they had the option of keeping it on top, again, we want to preserve that information. We want to preserve that part of the game state as best we can. So, how do we figure this out? We ask the players. We ask, do you know the location of any cards in your deck? Sometimes, most of the time, they'll say, nope, don't know anything. Then you'll name a card, like nothing like R2-D2, Inferno 4, Reinforcement, etc. And they'll say, oh yeah, I actually did blah blah blah. And then you're off to the races. However, sometimes, relatively frequently, they'll be like, nothing, and you're like, okay, any of these examples? And like, nope, definitely don't know the location of any cards in my deck. And then you just go ahead and shuffle the whole deck. So I generally recommend naming a few cards of differing aspects. I like, as you've been hearing, U-Wing, Vader, R2, and Inferno 4. These cards all see some amount of play, so players are relatively familiar with their effects. However, they're not all going to be played in the same deck. And so you're not implying, like, it's not like walking up to a blue-green villainy deck and being like, hey, have you resolved any Inferno 4s? And thus reminding the opponent that, oh, hey, Inferno 4 or Vader exists. So by having a wider spread, you are less likely to just trigger something in the opponent. However, you do want to have some mention of cards just to help jog their memory. We can also check to see if the player shuffled their deck recently. That doesn't happen often in Star Wars. I think right now there's Annihilator and Search Your Feelings, and I think there's like 1 or 2 cards that search for like bounties or very specific cards. Like, it's fewer than 5 cards that search the whole deck and have you shuffle the whole deck. But if we've recently resolved one of those effects, we don't have to worry about anything that happened before that point in time, because the entire deck was randomized at that point. So we do want to go through and evaluate what has happened in the past. If the player doesn't remember, or even if they do, we look to see what's in play. Do we see any Darth Vaders or R2s or Inferno 4s? If we see our Inferno 4 in the discard pile, we say, how did this get here? And they say, oh, it was defeated. And you're like, okay, when you resolved it when played and when defeated, how did you put cards onto the top and bottom of your deck? Or with R2, how many times did you attack with this R2? Now, sometimes this isn't the most straightforward of information to acquire. The player might not remember how many times they've attacked with R2. They might just be like, I think it was 3, it might have been 4, I don't really know. And that's going to happen. We're not going to have perfect information. However, we can get some information. If I've had no other units in play, and my opponent's base has taken 3 damage, I can guess that I've attacked with R2 3 times, because that's been my only source of damage. And so we can look at other information other than cards in play. If players are keeping track of damage by writing it down and writing it down incrementally, if I see 3 increments of 1, I can say, was there anything else dealing 1 damage? No, those were probably R2 increments. And players can be like, yep, that makes sense. And I'm like, okay, now of those, do you remember putting any on the bottom, any on the top? Sometimes players aren't going to remember. They're going to be like, I definitely put 1 on the bottom, definitely put 1 on the top. Although I can't remember if R2's look at the top and then put it on the bottom, or just look at the top. Anyways, if you're uncertain of how much knowledge a player has, it's okay to give a little bit of wiggle room. If we're off by 1, I would say generally we want to just preserve an additional random card rather than accidentally shuffle more cards in. That card at the bottom of the deck is a random card, and it's supposed to be a random card. We would know if we've R2'd 3 times, so we know the bottom 3 cards. We think we know at least 3 times, maybe 4, and then we have 25 cards above that. This one card being just preserving that on the bottom, it's a random card. It not being the card that we accidentally saw or otherwise need to shuffle into the random portion of the deck, being 1 out of 25. That's fine to preserve that extra card just as a safety, rather than shuffling a card that is known on the bottom of the deck into the unknown portion of the deck. McFerguson says, random thought, if they don't remember the non-random card anymore, isn't that kind of random again? So we're talking about random and not random, as opposed to known or unknown, or remembered or forgotten. Players are allowed to forget all sorts of information that the game tracks. The game knows things that players don't, to put it in a slightly ominous way. The game knows which cards are on the bottom, and even if the player has forgotten, we don't want to shuffle away those cards, because per game rules, those cards belong there, and shuffling them away it's relatively minor. It's an incredibly minor disruption if we accidentally shuffle 1 too many cards, or 1 too few cards, or even 2 or 3. It does get a little bit more impactful if we're at the end of the game and it's like, hey, I've played Darth Vader twice, and I've resolved all 3 of my Inferno 4s both when played and when defeated. So I know the bottom 20 cards of my deck, and I have 22 cards remaining in my deck. Being off by 1 or 2 there can be very impactful, because it's the player theoretically knows the vast majority of the order of the rest of their deck. Wolfstride 562 says, well, what if, let's say one player says, my opponent said, you missed this trigger, which causes them to learn new info. Then the opponent says they never said anything, so it becomes app said and app said. That falls into subjective investigations. And we'll talk about that in a minute. However, I mean, we can blend the two of these together a little bit. You have to figure out which player you believe. Is there, like, you look at motivation, you look at why a player would say something like that. It's really tough. But, like, if the statement one player said changes the outcome of the game in their favor, that's an incentive to say that. One of the weird things that happens, especially at larger events and especially at international events, so if you're going to Galactics, expect this to happen. I say something, you heard me say pass, but I said something different, like attack, but I haven't picked up any cards because I'm thinking about what I'm attacking with. I just say attack, you hear pass, so you go, okay, I attack like this, or I pass, and you immediately draw. Neither player has committed an error here. It's just poor communication and mishearing, and that happens. People mishear other people all the time. And you need to figure out why the players believe that these two realities exist. And we'll go more into this in subjective investigations. Mad Dog Max says, opponent said they didn't know where an A-Wing came from, was active player said, non-active player said, pulled them aside and had them replay their turn out. Ultimately, the resources were available for an A-Wing. I don't see how I could take it back to hand from what I could see. Yeah, so, like, if you look at the board state and they have 6 resources exhausted, and players agree, we've played a 4-drop and there's nothing else that costs 2 in play, probably did play the A-Wing, even if you didn't hear it, even if you've forgotten about it. Look for real indicators, like how the resources are exhausted, or how damage has been dealt, or where cards are. This objective investigations, when it goes to memory, start becoming a little bit of subjective, because players like, I think I activated Yoda 4 times, but I'm not really sure. And we're trying our best to get as close to reality as we can. But for identifying the order of the deck, the vast majority of the time it's super simple, super straightforward. But it's sometimes a little bit more complex. Sometimes we need to determine... Headkin says, seems like a lot of the problems at high-level events and from the scandals we've had come down to poor communication. Yep, that's it. Like, that's where the vast majority of errors occur. The vast majority of the time when an error occurs, both players are honest and trying their best. At high levels of play, players know the rules better than players who are newer to the game. They have more experience with their decks, so they're less likely to make dexterity errors or forget about things. And they're trying... Very often what happens is players try to be more precise with their language, or if some players are like, I'm worried I'm sharing too much information by communicating, and so I'm going to communicate less on purpose to try and mitigate any advantage my opponent could get from the words I'm saying. And either over-communicating or under-communicating can cause communication issues. Plus, if you're in a large hall with many people, if it's a foreign event or an international event with lots of people speaking with... different, like, with a variety of languages and accents, communication becomes a big thing. For most other things, like for any rules infraction, there are more likely to be facts, more likely to be objective, like we're talking about now. If I play a unit and then attack with my exhausted unit, my opponent can say, you just played that, it's exhausted. You can't attack with it. And that's objective. We agree on that. If it's, you say that I said attack Vader, and I'm like, no, attack Trooper. And you're like, no, you changed your mind when I said, okay, they trade. Like, at that point, both players may be living in separate realities. Like, one of the harder things to accept for some people is that two players can believe two mutually exclusive things and to both be honest. One player could absolutely believe that they said attack Trooper. The other person knows that the other person said attack Vader. And neither of them is wrong. And so you have to make some decisions based on that. And yeah, as Mad Dog Max says, lots of silent games, especially from seasoned players, are mostly silent. At a certain point, people start to assume that they know what their opponent is going to do and that their opponent knows what they're going to do. And so we don't need to communicate. We can just play fast and I can just show you the card and things are going to resolve correctly because I trust you, you're a good player. And then we realize, wait, I wanted to do something weird there, or I missed a trigger or something. Communication is always one of the hardest things to manage, and it's always the spiciest. Just because it is so impactful on games, and because there isn't an object, there isn't a card or a rule that we can point to say this is the issue or this is the solution. Back to determining game history. Good Lord, we're like a quarter of the way through this and halfway through my time for today. Mad Dog Max says, I still think the back and forth nature of the game causes more issues to be noticed immediately as opposed to other games, at least. Absolutely, 100%. So many more issues are caught immediately because as soon as you do a thing, I'm like, wait, I am interacting with that thing that you just did and that is wrong. Which is great, makes fixing things so much easier. Anyways, determining game history. So again, we figure out what has happened before. Generally, what I do when I'm trying to determine the game history, like the example that Mad Dog Max gave earlier, where we're trying to figure out whether or not an A-Wing was played, is pick a point in the timeline, either the current moment with the current game state or the point that I'm interested in, like when the A-Wing was played, and either work from now to that point or from that point to now. I prefer to work backwards in time, starting at the current moment, going to that target moment, because players are more likely to remember what just happened. They have the cards in front of them, and they're less likely to have to rely on memory, and our human memories are incredibly, incredibly flawed. As they go back in time, it's easier to remember the game's events. They're like, right before I attacked with Sabine, I played a daring raid, and right before the daring raid, I played the A-Wing. And it's like, okay, we now see this sequence, we see the exhausted resources, everything lines up. Whereas I'm like, what happened after you played the A-Wing? You're like, either I attacked or I played daring raid or I did something else. I can't remember. Maybe I activated my leader. Who knows? Whereas if you go back, it's one step at a time rather than a larger jump. With determining the game state, you want to look at both players' side of the board. So when you're looking at a player's deck, you're generally looking only at that player's deck. And you're going to be asking a lot of questions like, what did this takedown defeat? Okay, how is its on defeat trigger resolved? These questions, and the more detail that you get into, like, you just want to know if a takedown was played as you're going back in time. You don't really need to know how the on defeat was handled if it's relevant, or if it's not relevant. And most of the time in just determining what has happened, it's not. If you're thinking about a rewind or a backup, knowing that information is important because you're going to have to undo that. A very useful tool is the discard pile. Most players don't rearrange their discard pile, and so it is generally a timeline of things that have happened. There are units that have been defeated, cards that have been discarded, events that have been played, and you can just go back in that timeline and be like, okay, how did this happen? How did this happen? How did this happen? What happened around that? Okay, we got to the point where we've discovered that you did in fact play the A-Wing. If a player's uncertain, if a player doesn't remember, again, we can separate those players, sit somebody down. I really do like to sit down at the match with a player. I sit in their opponent's seat. I look at the player's hand, actually get into the seat of the player and look at the game from their perspective. Then put down the hand and look at the player and say, okay, you can't remember what happened before you attacked with Sabine. What were you thinking when you made the decision to attack with Sabine? And they're like, well, since I just removed their Sentinel, I could attack with Sabine now. And I'm like, cool. So you just removed their Sentinel. And they're like, you're right, I did. Daring Raid right here. Okay, that happened before Sabine. And before that, I attacked the Sentinel with this unit to deal enough damage for Daring Raid to take it out. And so on and so forth, right? They're able to build based on that memory. And you can talk about intent and strategy and cards in hand when the opponent isn't present, which allows you to get deeper into their history. Alright, card counts. This doesn't happen too much in Star Wars, but sometimes somebody will be like, hey, I think my opponent has too many cards in hand, or resources. Or sometimes a player will draw some cards, think about resourcing a long time, and be like, wait, I don't remember if I resourced. Thankfully, the core of card counting has fewer variables in Star Wars than in other games. Other games, mulligans have you decrease in the number of cards you start with, or have asymmetric draw patterns. Most TCGs have asymmetric draw patterns where the player who's going first is usually down cards or resources in some way. Whereas in Star Wars, you start with the same number of cards unless you're running Colossus. Is it Colossus with the 5-card hand? I think that's the only one that affects starting hand size. And then you're always drawing 2 cards per turn. And so that information is relatively static, plus the fact that you're allowed to play a resource every turn if you want to, again, is relatively static, and most players do up until a point. And so it is a little bit harder for a player to forget if they've played a resource. They can just be like, yep, I'm on 7, my opponent's on 7, I haven't ramped, they haven't ramped. And it's relatively straightforward. Mad Dog Max says, we had a missed smuggle replacement, compared both opponents' resources and counted for ramp to figure it out. Yep, that's it exactly. Have you played any Super Laser Techs resupplies? The bounty that I can't remember the name of, any of those cards that ramps you? They say no. Okay. Well, have you skipped any resources? They say no. Have I skipped any resources? No, because last turn I played a 6-drop and I'm still at 6, I think. And yeah, you just account for counting resources. It's account for ramp, make sure no player has skipped any resource drops, which may happen more frequently in the late game or limited if somebody's doing something weird. Most of the time, though, players are playing resources every turn, so it's relatively straightforward to be like, hey, you have 5 resources, your opponent has 6, neither of you is playing ramp, neither of you has ramped, one of you has the incorrect number of resources. How has this happened? If the player down resources has smuggled, probably didn't resolve the replacement. If the player up resources has smuggled, maybe 2 cards stuck together as they were taking cards off the top of their deck for that adding resource. Sometimes, though, you have to dig a little bit deeper. You want to figure out if the player has the correct number of cards in hand. And this number isn't directly linked to the number of cards their opponent has, because one player can play more cards or play cards that let them draw cards, return cards from discard, that sort of thing. There are 2 approaches to this. There's a card-by-card approach, which gets a little too mathy for my brain. And then there's a little bit more of a holistic account. Really, both processes are the same. They're counting the total number of cards that a player has accessed, which is every net card that has left the deck. So if you draw a card and then put a card back into the deck, that's net 0. If you draw a card from one effect and then later return a card to the deck, that's going to be net 0. We can go through and talk about, like, how many cards is each card worth. A Heroic Sacrifice says draw a card. This is worth +1 card. Ewing Reinforcements can be worth +0 to +3 because it can put as few as 0 and as many as 3 units into play out from the deck. Smuggle cards are worth +1 in this system. And so you tabulate how many cards above the starting number, the baseline number, you expect this player to have. So for every extra card that they've drawn, +1. For every card they've returned to the deck, -1. And you get a sum value. Then you count all of the cards, and you essentially compare this number to what the opponent has. This is, again, this system isn't the most intuitive to me. I prefer the holistic counts, where you start the other way around. You start by counting every card the player has access to. So every card in play, including resources, every card in their discard, every card that's been captured, every card in their hand, not the leader and base, because those never start in the deck. So every card that is no longer in the deck, that started the game in the deck, you count that number. I have 22, my opponent has 19. Great. Then we subtract all of the cards from our starting hands. That's 6 for each of us, because neither of us is playing Colossus to make life easier. We subtract the number of cards that each player has drawn from regroup. If we're not certain what that number is, that's when we do our little card count. We go to the opponent's side of the board, figure out how many additional cards they've accessed, subtract from the total. So they have 19, they've accessed 3 additional cards, so that's 16. 6 cards for their starting hand, 10 other cards. That means 5 cards, or 5 rounds. I should be at 6 plus 10 from regroup. I'm at 16. I've accessed 6 additional cards, and we check to make sure that's the same. Headkin says this is starting to sound like card counting in blackjack. This is why we call it counting cards. It's literally just counting cards that have left the deck and comparing it to what the other player has to see if we're at the appropriate amount of divergence. It's essentially total cards accessed equals starting hand size, cards drawn for regroup, cards accessed in other ways. And what you want to have happen is these numbers to essentially be balanced, right? If we find out on this hypothetical card count where we agreed 6 from opening hand, 10 from regroup, I have 22 cards, but I have 7 cards that have allowed me to draw an extra card from my deck, I am short 1 card. And we figure out what effect that was, how that card was supposed to go into my hand. If I have 5 cards that effectively draw a card, then I have 1 too few cards. Sometimes we know what round it's on because both players are like, yep, we haven't missed any resources, so we're clearly on resource turn 5, which means we've had 3 regroups. And so 6 extra cards in addition to starting hand size. We're at 12. Okay, we count real fast. We're at 15. We should be at 16. You're missing a card. I'm just spewing a lot of numbers here, and it gets real complicated. But Davi says, curious about your thoughts on when subjective investigation crosses the line and the game is unsalvageable. Had a game at a PQ where another judge spent around 15 to 20 minutes investigating what happened before a player accidentally placed their deck on top of their resources in a very, very long game. After the match, the player's opponent came to you and said that he felt uncomfortable with how long they had to spend on the fix, and in the end they had to just guess about some decisions. So 15 to 20 minutes does seem like an excessive amount of time for this. This sounds essentially like a card manipulation error, and I want to preserve the outcome of the game, a natural outcome of the game. The level of what is salvageable versus unsalvageable differs depending on the judge. I have a decade of experience judging events. There were years where judging was my sole source of income. I was judging 500 to 2,000 player events every weekend, right? I have a lot of experience judging, which means I can fix things that other people are like, this is unsalvageable, I don't know how to fix this. And I'm like, I've seen this before, I can fix it. And so I can't give you hard and fast rules on what is salvageable and what's not salvageable. As Mad Dog Max says, some people might be inexperienced and they're trying to fix it. They don't know how, and so they're learning as they go. 15 to 20 minutes is an excessive amount of time for a non-cheating investigation. However, I would rather have those players have a natural outcome of their game than a judge being like, well, I don't know how to fix it. I'm not going to try. I'm just going to issue a game loss because that's easier for me. I think that leads to a very poor player experience long term. Ideally, no judge ever says that, but that is how it will be perceived by players moving forward, I think. It's difficult though. Like players also do get frustrated very reasonably by sitting there for a long time while an investigation happens and it doesn't feel like it's a perfect fix. They're like, hey, I sat here for 10 minutes and then we had to like hand wave some things, or we weren't 100% certain, or we waited 10 minutes and then my opponent got a game loss. Why did I sit there for 10 minutes? I could have told you it was a game loss right out the gate. Players will always be unhappy with long investigations. Almost always. Usually one person's happy because they didn't get a game loss or they weren't disqualified. But yeah, it's difficult for long calls. Wolfstrider says if a deck is 50 cards and count all the cards and somehow get to 51, at some point a card was added and can be seen as cheating. For game 1, if you're at 51, that's a deck problem, and if you don't call it on yourself, that's absolutely a game loss. We talk about this a little bit in the deck and deck list problem lessons, where we have these harsher penalties to help disincentivize intentional cheating. Absolutely could be cheating. Also could be the player forgot to, like, they have a 2-1 split of a card, 2 in the main, 1 in the board, and they just simply forgot that they added to their deck, and so when they were going through the deck removing cards for their sideboard, they simply forgot to remove it. So could be cheating. Also many very innocent explanations. But alright, going back to card counts, sometimes you need to determine what round it is. Looking at the resources played is generally a good indicator, unless players are like, yeah, we've skipped some number of resources. For when doing this, we look to what the opponent has. We generally hope that it's not one player has, like, we generally trust that the other player has the correct number of cards. We do want to do a thorough count and do our math. We don't want it so that I can skip a draw and then say, hey, my opponent has too many cards. I think they're cheating. And when there's no explanation, because they in fact have the correct number of cards, but they have proportionately more. You just want to be thorough in your counts and make sure that you count the other side of the board to verify your numbers. A common error in card counting is missing something like Colossus, which changes the base that you're counting up from. You'll also want to check to see if any cards have returned to a hidden zone. For example, if a player returns Restock to their hand, that significantly alters the card count, because while returning a card from your discard to your hand doesn't change the card count at all, no cards were taken or added to the deck. The Restock was played and up to 4 cards were added back to the deck. While every card that has been resolved is public information, you don't want to say, you have a Restock in your hand. Did you play that and return that with Bounty Hunter Crew? You want to separate the players for that. Rickhill says Cobb and Thrawn as well. Yes. Cobb will do some weird things. Thrawn will do some weird things. Double triggers with boss, like which triggers triggered twice, might be a question that you need to ask. Moving on to base health discrepancies. Sometimes players will disagree on the amount of damage on a unit or base, although more frequently on a base than a unit. When this happens, you need to reconstruct the game state and event history. One of the most powerful questions you can ask for any sort of objective investigation is, how did this happen? It's very broad and lets players include additional information. You look at discard and play, account for units that may have attacked, account for healing, talk to both players and be like, okay, at what point do you remember agreeing on this total? You both agreed that in the last round it was at 19 damage on base. Now one of you says 22, the other says 23. How did we get either 3 or 4 damage? What sources could have done this? This is why I encourage players to track damage totals on a sheet of paper. Not only is a written value less likely to be jostled, dice and tokens can be moved around, they can be accidentally flipped, but a written record also comes with a history. It comes with increments of, I went from 19 to 22, and it's like, okay, we're looking for an increment of 3 damage. Or we go back further, and it's like, hey, I see you going from 15 to 18 to 22, not 15 to 19 to 22 like your opponent has. So, strongly encourage written records. Verkil says, great session. Hope you have a written guide to go with it. If you go to the lessons page on Nexus, we have lessons on both objective investigations and subjective investigations. Those lessons are available. Videos are also available. Okay. Relying on player testimony. Oh boy. We're getting close to when I need to cut off. But we call these objective investigations, but you'll note that a lot of the time we're relying on players' memory or their interpretation of events. This is why we want to rely as much as possible. Like, if somebody's like, yeah, I played the A-Wing, it's like, okay, what resources did you exhaust for that? Like, what else did you play this turn? Let's show me that there's evidence of this. If there's physical evidence, it's a lot easier to believe you. Now, players can still do things maliciously. A player could have said pass, and then they exhaust 2 resources and drop an A-Wing into play and be like, no, I totally played the A-Wing before passing, or like adjust life totals on a life pad and lie and cheat about that. Players are absolutely going to do that. Not frequently, but players do cheat sometimes. It's focus on objective information as much as you can, but sometimes players will change objective information. A lesson for you to go through is see how good your memory is. Ask friends to occasionally come up to you and ask you information about your game or match after you've completed your game or match. Just ask them to be like, what was your turn 1 play? Who dealt the first point of damage to a base? That sort of thing. And just be like, see yourself get stun locked and be like, I have no idea what happened. I do not remember those details. They're important for the investigation, and if you work your way back, you will be able to remember them. But a player not being able to remember what happened isn't a sign of any sort of malicious activity. Sometimes you're going to have to just make a call with confidence. You're not always going to be 100% certain of what happened. You're going to get to an app said situation where you have to make a decision. This is where the judge comes in, your judgment. Express your understanding, what that understanding comes from, what evidence you're going with. Let them know that it's your final ruling. Be prepared to be appealed. That's something that happens. As I toggle over to subjective investigations for the next 15, maybe 20 minutes, Kel Rilo says, when will the next master exam for the next set be up? So I have on my other tab Legends of the Force rules update lesson that I'm working on not as we speak, but before and after this broadcast. That will be going up as soon as the rules are available publicly. Historically, we've gotten the rules a little bit before pre-release. I think for Jump to Lightspeed, it was the Monday before pre-release. And then we've historically gotten the policy updates the week of release. So I'll release the rules as soon as CR5 is available. I'll release the policy lesson as soon as the Master Event Document Tournament regulations are available. And then once both of them are available, I'll release the Mastery Quiz. So I would expect probably release weekend, which is July 11th to 13th for all of the Mastery lessons and Mastery exams. I'm also targeting to have the L1 lessons and Apprentice lessons updated for Legends of the Force by then, and the L1 and Apprentice quizzes updated for Jump to Lightspeed and Legends of the Force. We have a lot that we're doing. Oh, also, we're going to continue to release level 2 lessons, and also I'm moving. It's fine. I'm not overworked. I have it all under control. Right. Let's talk about subjective investigations for a little bit. I don't have hard answers for you. I'm not going to be able to tell you whether or not somebody was cheating from a text message. But a reality of investigations is that it's going to be based on your intuition and your judgment. The number of times a player says, I did it, you caught me, that does not happen. I think I've had that happen to me maybe once, where a player came up to me much later and you're like, you're right, I did that, I did it on purpose, I feel bad about it, thank you for disqualifying me, I've learned my lesson, I appreciate you. Like, I feel bad that I did that, because that's not the kind of person I am. I was just caught up in the heat of the moment. I do have a friend who did a mid-round deck check on somebody, and the player said, well, the jig is up. But the vast majority of the time, they're gonna, even after you disqualify them, say, I didn't do it, it was a mistake, I'm an honest player. It happens. You're never going to know. Even if you know the player made the mistake, even if you know that they've made the mistake before and it changed the outcome of the match in their favor, and even though that can be factual, even though you can have all that information, you don't know whether or not the player intentionally committed this mistake. You have to rely on, as I mentioned, your intuition, judgment, experience, and the quality of your investigation to make your final ruling. And this is why it's very important that the head judge is involved in all investigations almost from the get-go. A floor judge asking a couple of questions to trigger their spidey sense, which is not something I'm putting in the lesson because licensing, but I can say here. Having them do the floor judge take a couple of questions, great. Having the floor judge do a full investigation, come to the head judge and say, here's a player that you have to disqualify. I'm not going to be able to do that. I'm going to need to do that investigation myself. I'm going to need to talk to the players, look at the board state, and determine through my own judgment whether or not this player cheated. Even with very experienced judges, I'm like, if I'm going to disqualify the player, I need to explain to them why they're disqualified. And so I need to do the investigation. So, now this doesn't mean you have to investigate solo. Having the initial judge on the call shadow you so you can see if the story changes, talk to them, bounce ideas off them, or talking with your mentors or other more experienced judges, just being like, hey, this is the situation real fast because this is live. This is where I'm at. This is what I'm thinking. What are your thoughts? Are there any questions you'd ask? Is there anything that would change your mind? Super helpful to do. It's also super difficult to investigate for cheating. You're not going to be good at it. Don't worry about it. Out of the thousands of judges I know, there are maybe like 5 that I think are actually good at investigations, just because it's kind of like mind reading. Are you good at mind reading? You're not psychic? Okay, there we go. You do get better at them. You do get more confident. If you're ever 100% confident in all of your investigations, you're wrong. I'm probably... I mean, the numbers are arbitrary. I'm relatively confident in my investigations at this point. But again, I've been doing it for a decade and have been a part of many. Another challenge in learning investigations, and I know I'm talking fast, but, a disturbance in the force is really good. I'm going to use that. Thanks, Wolfstrider. But it's really hard to learn how to do investigations. With rules, you can read the rules and now you know the rules. With policy, you can read the policy and you're like, I'm not really sure how this works, but you have somebody play a mock game, make an error, and then have you come in and fix it, and that can solidify that knowledge in your head. If you have your friends like play a game and have them mock cheat, knowing that there's like a 50-50 chance of cheating, which is way, way higher than it is in real life, and seeing your friend act like, oh no, I didn't know I couldn't draw 5 cards every round. Like, your friends are not Oscar winner performers, and like the information that they give is going to be somewhat scripted. It's not a really good test of investigations. The number of times I've seen an investigation workshop, which is helpful, they are helpful, but sometimes like an actor will just say something and it'll just be like, oh, clearly not cheating, clearly cheating, because of this thing that the person said that a real person wouldn't have said. But how do you get better at them? You can get better at them. First thing you want to do, rule out cheating. Every single call you take, anytime there's an error of any sort, ask yourself internally, why is this not cheating? They forgot to draw for regroup. Probably not cheating because they have 25 cards left in deck and no cards in hand. They're not avoiding anything. Not cheating, easy. Getting to, you're never, as mentioned, you're never going to be able to be 100% confident that it is cheating. It's a lot easier to be confident that it's not cheating. For example, player didn't gain an advantage, not cheating. Player wasn't aware of the mistake, like, it's a weird rule, not cheating, right? The more you can rule it out, when you get to a situation where you're like, I've asked 50 different questions, and I have not been able to rule out cheating, you gotta convince me somehow, right? As you get used to being able to rule out cheating, it becomes easier to be like, okay, this is something that I need to investigate further, or this is something that I believe is cheating. You can look at the context of a match. Somebody not drawing cards for regroup, probably not cheating most of the time, unless they have no cards left in their deck and 6 health left on their base. That's a lot more concerning if they forget to regroup and take 6 damage. You can also, so when you're working on policy, you should not look at player experience, player age, the deck they're playing, that sort of stuff, for issuing infractions. Like, if a player makes a gameplay error, you shouldn't be gentle at competitive tier simply because the player is newer or younger with regard to, for example, attacking a base instead of a sentinel. That's policy. However, when you're looking into cheating, you can be like, okay, this is a player's first event. They probably didn't do this on purpose because they probably don't know the rules. There was a player who submitted a 14-card sideboard because in other games you're allowed to have up to a 15-card sideboard. And so they didn't know they were cheating. They didn't know they'd made an error, right? They weren't cheating because they didn't know that they had made an error. You can ask yourself, and probably answer without asking the players directly, is what parts of the game does this impact? So a player forgetting to draw cards, it impacts the number of cards in their hand. If a player exhausted too many resources and not enough resources, like, you can look at their hand and be like, oh, there was nothing that they could have played. There was no possible way for them to use the extra resource that they left open. They have, like, the only thing they have left in their hand is Avenger. The difference between having 2 resources up and 3 resources up is relatively minor. It is less likely to be cheating because there's, like, yes, their opponent might have played around a 3-drop event instead of only 2-drop events. But that is minor. We've talked a lot about certainty already. I want to just do a broad overview of, some people simply need to feel more confident that a player is cheating than not. Some judges express that says 51% certain. I don't love that phrase, but questions that you have to answer for yourself philosophically are, how many innocent players are you willing to disqualify to catch one cheater, to disqualify one cheater? Because there is, as you investigate players and disqualify players, there's a chance that you'll be wrong. If you disqualify everybody that you investigate, you'll probably get all the cheaters. You'll also get a lot of innocent players. Is that something you're comfortable with? Probably shouldn't be. Think about what happens if you're wrong. If you disqualify somebody who's innocent, what happens to that player? They maybe quit the game forever. They maybe quit TCGs forever. They're maybe ostracized by their local community. You don't DQ somebody who did cheat. The outcome of your tournament is different, and it's bad. Somebody who should not have won wins. But you can also go back and disqualify that player later in the tournament. It's very hard to undisqualify a player. So think about the consequences. Think about... This is entirely internal and doesn't change the outcome of your investigation, but it does change how certain you may feel you need to be. So let's talk about some strategy for investigations in the couple of minutes I have left. Risk for reward. How do you know when to ask more questions? If you don't know, if you're not able to figure out why it's not cheating, you can ask the players, right? Don't say to the opponent, hey, do you think your opponent was cheating? That's not great. You can ask, how impactful is your opponent having one extra resource right now? Or if we hadn't caught it, would that extra point of damage matter significantly? You can be like, hey, does this matter? And if it doesn't matter, if you're just like, oh yeah, if the opponent's like, yeah, that is completely meaningless, they have me dead anyways, or I have them dead no matter what they do, it does not matter. The risk there is still the same, but the reward is much less. Or if they're like, oh, it changes the match entirely, the reward is much greater. Then we talk about the risk. You need to balance the risk in your determination. And like deck list problems, like changing your deck, those are relatively low risk because your opponent until the top 8 doesn't get to see your deck list, and so you're able to manipulate your deck in ways that are harder for your opponent to catch. So those sorts of cheats are relatively low risk. However, playing like an Inferno, saying that you're playing an Inferno 4, exhausting 2 resources and putting an Avenger into play, that's very high risk. Your opponent will be like, that costs 7 resources more than you paid for it. That seems illegal. So the like visibility of the error is important. Hedkin says it's like the standards of proof: beyond reasonable doubt, clear and convincing, preponderance of the evidence, probable cause, and reasonable suspicion. I don't know the like legal definitions of those. But generally the philosophical guidance I give is, do you think your event is better without this player in it? If you think that this player is more likely to have cheated than to have not. Something that you don't need is 100% evidence. We're not in a court of law. And we're not going to get that evidence in a reasonable amount of time. So you should investigate to the point where you feel comfortable. For me, with my skill in investigations growing, I'm no longer at the 51% point because I'm generally more confident in my investigations. And so like my threshold for where I DQ has increased over time because I'm more confident in my investigations overall. So I'm giving myself a narrower band to work in. But we've talked about risk and reward. You can talk to the players to evaluate that risk and reward. So, the next thing that I want to talk about, and I'm going to spend like 2 minutes on this, is, even though it's much larger, there's a great series of articles called Collateral Truths, written by a judge for another game, that a lot of judges for a variety of games base their investigation planning on. But the idea is, when you see a situation, come up with a story of how this happened. How did the player play Avengers Inferno 4? Or how did the player draw an extra card? Come up with a story, and then ask yourselves, what things make this story true or untrue? What makes this narrative or sequence of plays true or untrue? And ask questions about those. For example, let's say a player has an extra card in their resources. How did this happen? Well, we start with an open-ended question just to get an overall idea. Can you walk me through your turn, mimic the physical actions you took? And they show you at some point, they smuggle a card, take cards off the top of their deck and slide them into your resources. Now I have an idea in my head that when they resourced an extra card, or resourced the card from smuggle, an extra card got added there. What can convince me? Well, if I look at their deck and like pick a card off the top of the deck and the next card sticks to it because the sleeves are so dirty, that's pretty convincing. If I like touch the deck and the deck explodes in 17 directions and cards slide into the resources as I'm watching, again, that's a very reasonable explanation. And it's one truth. It's something that I observed. The cards are very sticky or the cards are very slippery, and so they might accidentally go into the resources, with an actual event that happened that I wasn't present to observe. If they're like, no, I didn't resource anything, I haven't touched the resource zone at all, I have no idea how that got there, it's like, okay, you used the resources, like last turn, you and your opponent agree, you made the comment of, I wish I had 9 so I could play it out of the Avenger, in my hand, that would swing the game, and now magically you do have 9. How are you not aware of this? Earlier this round, you were saying it'd be great if you had 9 resources. Nothing has happened since then that should grant you resources. Now you have 9 resources. How did this happen? And they might not have facts to support that. So take the facts that you uncover, turn them into a narrative, and then attempt to prove or disprove that narrative by asking more questions. Just be like, what would make this story where the player is cheating true or untrue? And you can ask a variety of questions. If a player's sideboard has old sleeves, their main deck has new sleeves, so the sideboard cards are marked, ask them, how did you sleeve your deck? And they're like, I bought new sleeves, saw my main deck was getting super worn out, but the pack only came with 60 because that's how many cards come in, or sleeves come in a pack. But I'm playing Data Vault, so I couldn't re-sleeve my sideboard, but they looked fine to me. That's a reasonable story. If I say, do you have those old sleeves still? And they pull out some really gnarly sleeves that are way worse than the sideboard sleeves, but the same color. I'm like, okay, this makes sense. This is a cohesive story. If I'm like, when did you do this? They're like, on the drive down. I was in the passenger seat, my buddy was driving. I'm like, cool. What's your buddy's name? And I go chat with the buddy and be like, hey, did your friend re-sleeve the deck on the drive down? That's a fact that supports another fact, or a fact that supports a story element, which, because we have that evidence, can now become fact and help support my story or my narrative that I'm constructing of what actually happened. If you're getting to the point where you don't have questions, consult with somebody else. If you're the head judge at a larger event, even if there's just one other judge and that judge took the call, be like, hey, do you have any questions? This is the story I have. What for you would lock it up? Again, talking with other judges, even if they weren't on the call, you do want to be relatively concise and efficient with your time, because these take a long time, especially as you mull things over and you have difficult feelings about it. And as you get more experience, you'll be able to be more decisive. However, there will be, especially early on, a lot of flip-flopping and trying to figure it out. But yeah, sometimes your mentor or somebody else will be like, no, that sounds like cheating to me. That sounds relatively straightforward. Other times they'll be like, what about this possibility? And you'll be like, oh, I hadn't considered that. That's a highly played card that would change this story. Has this happened? And the players are like, oh yeah, that did happen. You're like, okay, does that make sense as to how this error occurred? Players are like, yeah, 100%. That's almost certainly what happened. And you're like, great. I'm no longer worried. Something that happens a lot in cheating investigations is you're like, oh, I'm concerned. And then the player says something, you're like, I have no concern at all anymore. Or they say something, you're like, you're out of here. Like, it's very slow, and then sometimes you drop off a cliff or just ride up a hot air balloon just straight up into the air. But, alrighty. Lying to a tournament official is disqualifiable offense. In particular, this refers to lying to a judge during an investigation. So you can disqualify a player who is lying to you during the investigation, even if you're unsure if they did the game action legally or not. So you can be like, player drew an extra card. Okay, cool. They didn't call it on themselves. Why did they not call it on themselves? Like, there's the one investigation of, did they draw the extra card on purpose? And then there's this other investigation of, why didn't they call it when they realized it, if they appeared to have not called it on themselves? They could have known that. They might just say, oh, I didn't know. I didn't know I was supposed to call a judge. I thought it was on my opponent to call these sorts of things. Or I didn't realize I'd drawn the card. And you're like, I don't have proof one way or the other that of your intent. However, I do know that I've issued you a warning previously for the same infraction. So when you say, I thought it was a game loss, I know that that's not true. You're lying to me. Get out of here. Note that a player changing their story or their story becoming more detailed or less detailed as the investigation progresses isn't necessarily an indication of lying. As they think about it more, they may just have time to remember more details, or they're like, ooh, I wasn't certain about that, and now I'm certain that it's wrong, so I'm just going to gloss over it and hope they don't notice. Yeah, people trying to fix it themselves for time or politeness, them trying to fix it is not cheating. They shouldn't do that, and if they're aware that they shouldn't do that, and like they give themselves an advantage by fixing it, like, it can be cheating. A player being like, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize I'd drawn 7 extra cards. Let me just put a couple of them back and then we'll keep on playing. That'll be fine. I'll pick the worst cards in my hand to put back and I'll shuffle them in just because I really don't want to see them. That's super cheating. Now, if a player's like, oh crap, I didn't realize I'd drawn an extra card, let me put it away. It was this one, right? Do you agree that it was this one? And they try to fix it. Or they're like, here, you can pick the card, like they reveal their hand or whatever. They shouldn't be doing that. but it's not cheating to genuine, like if they don't know that it is against the rules to do what they are doing, not cheating. Now, this brings us to the last bits of investigation. Oh boy, I'm pushing the time on this. But as I get to the point where I'm preparing to disqualify a player, I make sure that I lay it out to them. I say, this is my understanding of what happened. This is my understanding of how it happened. Policy says that you're not allowed to do this. I believe that you did this on purpose or you didn't report this on purpose. This is cheating. The penalty for cheating is disqualification. Is there anything that you can tell me that can change my understanding? I don't want to disqualify players because it ruins their day, especially if I'm wrong. And I know that some of the times I had to have been wrong. I can't have had a 100% accuracy rate. Maybe I did, but I don't think so. And sometimes they're just like, I forgot to mention that, like, this is my first time playing this deck. And I'm like, oh, that changes my like, you had said that you've been playing for a while or something like that. Plus, even if it doesn't change the story, it gives them an opportunity to be heard. You're the head judge and they're going to want to appeal you. They're not able to. Once you make your ruling, that's final. But most players who cheat aren't cheaters. They just they made a bad decision. I know that some judges can get away with, did you do it? And some players just say, yes. That's extraordinarily rare, and that's more apocryphal than a real story. Also, a quick note on physiological responses. Don't rely on them. Don't rely on a player like looking away from you or making eye contact or blinking a lot or like closed body language. Some people are just nervous. My hands just shake a lot of the time, probably because I don't eat at appropriate intervals. Some people might be nervous because they're being investigated, not because they're cheating, but because they're being investigated by a judge is focused on them. So I would not rely on physiological responses. With all that being said, as you make your decision, just remember that your goal is that it's important to your goal is to improve the event and organize play as a whole. Consider how you're going to write your statement. If you believe the player made a bad decision and won't repeat in the future, say that. If you believe that they have a history of such infractions, say that. Your statement should remain private and submitted directly to FFG, along with the statement of the player and other relevant participants. If you have any final questions, please send them my way, because I need to be out of here in like a minute. Headkin says body language isn't used as evidence outside of TV. Yes, but a lot of people who are judges have watched a lot of TV and see themselves as very insightful of people, and don't have that actual experience. Anyways, I have to go. So long, farewell. I'll see you maybe on Friday. I'll include details in Discord. Bye.